So I've gathered ADP from a handful of the most popular fantasy platforms to collect basically an industry consensus ADP. The platforms that I picked were Sleeper, ESPN, Yahoo, CBS, and NFL.com. So all of the main redraft fantasy sites. And from this industry ADP, I have my top 3 picks from every single round of fantasy drafts. So looking at round 1, there honestly isn't a pick that I'm completely against. I definitely know where I want to be to start my draft, which is right in the middle, maybe shading towards the top rather than the back. But my absolute favorite pick here is Breece Hall, who is my RB2 for 2024 behind Christian McCaffrey. What Breece Hall has done for 2 years in a row now has been nothing short of spectacular, especially last year in his first year back from the ACL injury his rookie year. Running backs are not supposed to immediately return to elite production, but Hall was able to do that last year, averaging over 17 PPR points per game and finished as the RB2 overall and RB6 in fantasy points per game. Now heading into year 3 of his career, year 2 post ACL injury, I think Hall is set for an absolute massive season. A healthy Aaron Rodgers should elevate this offense to places that it hasn't been able to go to before with Zach Wilson, Trevor Siemian, Tim Boyle at quarterback. So playing on a better offense is going to lead to more sustained drives, which equals more plays and more touches for Breece Hall, and also more red zone opportunities, which, did you know that last year Breece Hall only saw 1 carry inside the 5-yard line? Just 1 carry. That is 17 fewer than Christian McCaffrey, 11 fewer than Jonathan Taylor, 9 fewer than Jahmyr Gibbs, and 4 fewer than Devon Achane, who played in practically half as many games as Breece Hall. There is a world where Hall scores 15 plus touchdowns this year, as he's able to score 9 times last year with absolutely 0 goal line work. He has no competition for touches like how Bijan has Tyler Algier still. He's a very young 23 years old. Again, now 2 years removed from major knee injury. He's one of just a couple actual bell cows left in the NFL with legit 100 plus target upside to pair with a 250 plus carry volume. There's just no real downside of taking Breece Hall as your hero RB to carry your team to the championship, and you remove yourself from the risk of Jamar Chase sitting out with his contract stuff. What is Justin Jefferson with Sam Darnold? Saquon is 4 years older than Breece Hall. Jonathan Taylor hasn't stayed healthy 2 years in a row. It's just not really all that common to be able to have a player who feels so safe as Breece Hall with the utter league-breaking upside that he also has, and to just be able to draft him in the mid-first round of your leagues. Now, my honorable mentions for round 1 go to Amon-Ra St. Brown and A.J. Brown as stud wide receiver 1s for your fantasy team. I do love Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb, but if you don't have a top 3 pick, you're not getting one of them. So Amon-Ra and A.J. Brown are much more accessible to a lot of you later in the first, and I'll plant my flag on them. I take Amon-Ra over Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, and I'm willing to take A.J. Brown over Jefferson too if you're not in love with Sam Darnold and don't really want to deal with that headache. We know what these 2 receivers can do. We know what they bring to the table, which is 14 to 1,500 plus yards, double-digit touchdowns. It's safe, it's great, it's fun. Don't overthink it. Moving on to round 2, I do love Travis Etienne here. I actually made a video about him a little bit ago that you can check out up in here, but the real answer for me is Isaiah Pacheco, the complete workhorse running back in Kansas City. His splits with and without Jerick McKinnon are something else from last year, going from around 13 PPR points per game with McKinnon up to almost 22 points per game without him, largely due to a massive increase in receiving work, basically doubling his output without Jerick McKinnon. In those 4 games last year, Pacheco was the bell cow running back for the Kansas City Chiefs, averaging 20 touches per game, over 100 yards per game, and he scored 5 times. So now in 2024, with Pacheco's only real competition being a currently injured Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Deneric Prince, and Carson Steele, Pacheco's about to have an absolutely massive fantasy season, and we've seen it already through 2 preseason games. The Chiefs starters have effectively played 2 drives, and Pacheco has played on every single snap of both drives and has either gotten a carry or ran a route on every single snap. You're realistically able to start your drafts with Breece Hall and Isaiah Pacheco based on this ADP, and if you do that, you probably don't really need to touch running back again until much later in your drafts. Honorable mentions for the second round go to Kyren Williams and Travis Etienne. I think that they are both going to be great this year, just like they were last year. I have no concerns about Blake Corum stealing work from Kyren. I think them drafting him had more to say about the Rams' backfield behind Kyren Williams than it did Kyren Williams himself. Plus, we just know that Kyren is basically better at everything than Corum, and McVay loves him as well. And like I said at the beginning of this round, I made a video about Etienne already, so you can go check that out to hear in more detail why I love Travis Etienne this year. All right, moving on to round 3. This one is so easy, and if you've been watching my content, you know exactly who I love in this round. 2 of them in particular. We're going to start first with De'Von Achane, the absolute home run swing in all of fantasy this year that I'm willing to take even in late round 2. And let me just say this. If you enter round 3 and De'Von Achane is still on the board, you are legally obligated to make that pick. There's just no other way to put it. You cannot pass on the game-breaking upside that De'Von Achane possesses in the 3rd round of fantasy drafts. Even if he only plays half the season like he did last year, he will literally win you weeks. Last year, he averaged 17 points per game in 11 games played, and that includes 2 games where he played under 10% of snaps. If you remove those 2 games, he averaged 20.8 fantasy points per game, which would have been good for RB3 last year. And even without his 50 bomb he dropped in week 3, he still averaged 17 points per game in the other 8 games that he played, which is right where Breece Hall was and ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs, Travis Etienne, and Saquon Barkley. I understand if you're concerned about injury or regression or whatever, but if De'Von Achane hits, I don't want to look back at the end of the year and regret not drafting him in the 3rd round. And my other favorite player here is Nico Collins, a player that I absolutely love, but apparently everybody in the comments does not. Everybody's all worried about Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell and Dalton Schultz for some reason, like any of them really matter, because honestly, Nico is just that much better than all of them. And if you don't believe so, I think you just need to visit the eye doctor. I've seen CJ Stroud projected for anywhere between 46 to 5,000 passing yards this year, 30 plus touchdowns easily. And if you don't think that's enough to make 3 players fantasy viable, then I don't know what to tell you. You can give all 3 receivers 1,100 receiving yards and still have 1,300 plus yards left over for Schultz or Mixon or Noah Brown or whoever else is on that team. And that's not even taking into account the what if Nico is just better and gets the 1,300 yards, and maybe Diggs is at 1,000, Tank Dell is at like 900, or vice versa between those 2. Diggs is turning 31 on a 1-year deal and looked horrible to end last year. Tank Dell is coming off of a broken leg, which is what hampered Tony Pollard for a large majority of last year, and he also got shot in the leg at a bar back in May. Nico just got a massive contract, was an uber elite route runner last year with major production, and is one of the best receivers in the league right now. Again, fantasy football doesn't have to be all that hard, so I'm drafting Nico Collins very confidently in the 3rd round. And then my honorable mention here, though, is Cooper Kupp, a whole round and a half later than Puka Nacua. I absolutely love that value for Kupp, as it wouldn't be surprising if Kupp outscored Puka, especially if this injury hampers Puka at all throughout the year. The reports are at camp that Cooper Kupp is fully healthy, back to 100%, and is still the focal point of this Rams offense. So if he can return to form, maybe not fully elite like 2021 form, but return to being a quality fantasy wide receiver 1, that is more than worth the pick here in the 3rd. On to the 4th round now. This is another easy one for me. It is Jaylen Waddle, going as the wide receiver 20 in the mid 4th round, which is just insane to me given the production that we've seen from him 3 years in a row as wide receiver 13, wide receiver 8, and last year was wide receiver 34 overall, but was the wide receiver 21 in fantasy points per game. Really, I think the issue is that people just see his end-of-year stats last year and think that's what he'll do this year, not realizing how impressive it actually was that Waddle was on pace for over 1,200 yards and a handful of touchdowns, while Tyreek Hill was chasing 2,000 yards from day 1. Everybody should be ecstatic about drafting Waddle in the 4th round. Again, a player that in his first 2 years in the league finished inside the top 13 at the position and was a top 10 fantasy guy 2 years ago with Tyreek Hill. If you're following these picks to create an ideal roster and you end up with 2 RBs in the first 3 rounds, getting Waddle in the 4th as your wide receiver 2 is phenomenal given the weekly ceiling that he has as a week winning type of player. And then again, my 2 honorable mentions for this round go to DK Metcalf and Mark Andrews. Metcalf was also highlighted in the same video that I talked about ETN, so you can check out that video for a more detailed argument in favor of DK. And then Andrews, I absolutely love again this year. You're getting a round to round and a half discount on Travis Kelce and Sam Laporta for a player that I think has just as good of a chance to be the fantasy tight end 1 this year. Absolutely nothing has changed for Mark Andrews offensively. He's still essentially the wide receiver 1 for Lamar Jackson, or the wide receiver 1A with Zay Flowers. And through the first 10 weeks of the year last year, Andrews was on pace for 80 receptions, almost 1,000 yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns. That is fantastic for any tight end, let alone the third one off the board. He just got hurt last year, isn't as sexy of a name as Laporta or Kelsey, so you're getting a very nice discount here that I like grabbing in the 4th round. Into the 5th round now, my favorite pick here is James Conner. Always and forever James Conner. I have no concern about Trey Benson this year, which is all that matters for redraft is just this season. Long term, I do think Trey Benson is going to be fantastic on this Cardinals team, but for 2024, this is still James Conner's backfield. Remember, Conner has done nothing to make the Cardinals stop giving him the ball. He has been excellent for them and for fantasy since 2021. He was the RB5 overall in 2021 on the back of 15 touchdowns. Then in 2022 was the RB19 overall, but the RB10 in fantasy points per game just because he missed a few games. And then last year, similar story, RB18 overall, but RB13 in fantasy points per game, including averaging 24 PPR points per game over the final 5 games of the season last year, and he literally won people championships with a 26-point performance in week 17. Listen, I understand that James Conner is going to miss games. That's just going to happen. That's just who James Conner is. But at this point at the running back position, everyone is probably going to miss games. DeAndre Swift, Ramondre Stevenson, Raheem Mostert, Zamir White, all could miss a few games too. We've seen it with most of them in their careers. It's just the nature of the running back position. But when all of these guys are healthy, my bet is that James Conner is the most productive out of all of them, just as he's shown now 3 years in a row in Arizona. And not to mention that this year might be the best Cardinals offense that we've seen in a very long time. Honorable mentions here go to actually 3 wide receivers, Malik Neighbors, Tank Dell, and George Pickens if Brandon Ayuk is not traded there. I think all 3 of these guys are pretty boom bust on a weekly basis. They all just feel very similar, so really it just comes down to personal preference, but I do prefer all 3 of them over guys like Zay Flowers and Amari Cooper here because I don't think either of them have the same weekly upside as the other 3, so shooting for upside as your wide receiver 3 or even wide receiver 4 here, I'd go with Malik Neighbors, Tank Dell, or George Pickens. Getting into the 6th round now, I love a ton of players here, but perhaps none more than Kyle Pitts. I have preached the Kyle Pitts breakout season on multiple videos on this channel, the DLF channel, all month long, and I'm going to continue to do it now. The stage is set for everything to go right for Kyle Pitts this year. He is fully healthy, 2 years removed from his major knee injury. The Falcons had a major quarterback upgrade in Kirk Cousins, who made TJ Hawkinson an elite fantasy tight end over the last year and a half. And Kyle Pitts himself has the size, speed, athletic ability, all of the opportunity and advanced analytics that you could want from a tight end. He is literally a wide receiver that you can put in the tight end slot of your fantasy roster. I said earlier that I love Mark Andrews in the 4th round, and that is very true. And if you don't want to buy into Kyle Pitts for like the 4th year in a row now, my next pick at tight end is Mark Andrews a little earlier. But if you're in on Pitts like me, this is a smash pick in the 6th round and one that I'd even be willing to make in the 5th round over other tight ends like Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid, and George Kittle. That is how much I love Kyle Pitts for the 2024 season. And then my honorable mentions here are a few other names. I think David Montgomery is great at this price point, especially if you stockpiled wide receivers early. Monty is an easy RB2 with RB1 upside should Jahmyr Gibbs miss any time, which he is currently dealing with an injury right now, so who knows how that plays out over the course of the entire year. I like T. Higgins here too as a return to form season for him, especially with Jamar Chase sitting out because of his contract, which still doesn't really make sense to me, but okay. And this is the first place that I would begin looking at quarterback with Kyler Murray, who I think can easily finish as a top 5 fantasy QB, but at a great discount compared to the other elite guys. All right, 7th round now, and my favorite pick here is Christian Kirk, Mr. Steady Eddie himself, who I fully believe is returning to the wide receiver 1 spot on this team, at least in terms of total targets. He was the wide receiver 1 in 2022, leading the team in receiving stats across the board, and actually, up until his injury last year, was the wide receiver 1 in 2023. He out-targeted Calvin Ridley and was the more productive fantasy player too. Same goes for Evan Ingram, who Kirk was also out-targeting prior to getting hurt, and Ingram's production didn't really explode until after Christian Kirk got hurt. So if we move into 2024, assuming that Kirk maintains that role in what is essentially the same offense it's been for the last 2 years, Kirk is more than likely going to lead the team in targets and could return to his 2022 production of over 14 fantasy points per game as a top 20 fantasy wide receiver. Or worst case scenario, Christian Kirk just repeats what he did last year before he got hurt as a borderline top 25 guy, which is still outperforming this ADP. What drafting Kirk allows you to do is to take some risk earlier in your drafts with high upside players, because Kirk is going to be that consistent wide receiver 3 or flex play to where if you hit on earlier bets, you could be looking at an elite fantasy roster. Some honorable mentions here go to Rashee Rice, especially if you went a little bit safer in the early rounds and you want to take some home run shots now. That shot here is Rashee Rice. He may end up getting suspended at the end of the year, who really knows, but as long as he's healthy and he's playing, his numbers last year were amazing as the wide receiver 1 for Mahomes. Hollywood is already banged up, Worthy operates in a very different part of the field, so Rice can just be a high volume PPR play, much like he was to end the year last year. And the other player is Jake Ferguson, who is basically my last ditch effort at getting a top 10 tight end if you miss out on Mark Andrews or Kyle Pitts. Drafting Ferguson here, I think, gives you a weekly starter that you don't have to worry about streaming or anything, and he could finish decently higher than tight end 10 if he sees 100 plus targets again like he did last year and has maybe a little bit of touchdown luck. If you do miss out on Jake Ferguson here, though, I'm just punting the position entirely until like the very end of my drafts. Into the 8th round now. This whole round is made for running backs, so 0 RB drafters, this one is for you. My favorite pick here is Brian Robinson, who I think is in line for the best season of his career in 2024. And there are a couple main arguments in favor of B-Rob's breakout 2024 season. Number one, 2023 was actually a lot better than people remember. From weeks 1 through 12 before he got hurt, Robinson was averaging 15 touches per game and was on a 17-game pace of almost 900 rushing yards, another 450 receiving yards, and 11 total touchdowns on 250 touches. He averaged a little over 14 PPR points per game and was the RB16 over that stretch, ahead of guys like Derrick Henry, Kenneth Walker, Isaiah Pacheco, and James Cook. So now fast forward to 2024, we have an overall upgraded offense entirely with the addition of Jayden Daniels, and we have a new offensive system under Cliff Kingsbury, who has operated offenses with great fantasy running backs in the past. In 2019, it was a 2-half season for the Arizona Cardinals, with David Johnson averaging 17 touches per game to start the year, pacing for 1,600 yards and 14 touchdowns, and was a top 8 fantasy tight end. And then they traded for Kenyon Drake mid-season. Drake then paced for 1,600 yards himself and 17 touchdowns over the second half of the year as a top 5 fantasy running back. Then in 2020, Drake was the full-time guy all year, put up 1,100 yards, 10 touchdowns on 265 touches, finishing as the RB16 in total points. And then, of course, in 2021 and 2022, James Conner was an absolute fantasy beast with a top 5 fantasy performance in 2021 and then a top 20 fantasy performance in 2022. So when I see players like James Conner, Kenyon Drake, and even an old David Johnson producing as top 20, even top 10 fantasy running backs in a Cliff Kingsbury offense, I am very interested in what Brian Robinson is going to do this year, especially after being a top 16 guy last year prior to getting hurt. He's not a sexy name. People might be concerned about Austin Eckler. I'm really not. And now with Jahan Dotson being traded to Philly, this team doesn't have a real wide receiver too. So Brian Robinson might get more receiving work on top of his first and second down role. I think this offense is honestly going to be way better than people think that it is, and B-Rob is going to be a big reason why. The other 2 running backs that I love here are Javonte Williams and Jonathan Brooks. Williams, I believe, is the main RB1 for Denver and will be in like a workhorse light role, with Jaleel McLaughlin acting primarily as a pass-catching running back. But Williams had a ton of volume last year in basically the same offense. He just wasn't all that efficient with it. But this year, he's 2 years removed from his horrible knee injury, so he should be a lot better and healthier, and I think he's being slept on just because he hasn't been all that productive since 2021 as a rookie. Then as for Jonathan Brooks, drafting him here is more of a second half of the season play. I honestly don't expect all that much from him early on, but later in the year, I think Jonathan Brooks takes over the backfield as the RB1 in a Dave Canales offense. We saw how much better Breece Hall was over the second half of the year last year coming off the ACL injury, and I think Jonathan Brooks can do something similar as a rookie. All right, into the 9th round, I gotta be honest, I don't really like much of what's going on in here. I think it's a really good place to go for quarterback, as I really love Jayden Daniels in this Cliff Kingsbury offense, especially if this Dotson trade means that Daniels is going to run more. That's just more fantasy points for us as a Konami code quarterback. I also don't mind the other rookie in Caleb Williams here, who has all of the talent in the world, just like Jayden Daniels, except his receivers are significantly better with DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, and Rome Odunze, plus DeAndre Swift out of the backfield. And we also know that Caleb Williams himself is a very mobile quarterback too. Or if you just want a veteran who you know is going to score points, but maybe doesn't have that ultimate fantasy ceiling, Jared Goff is in this range too, who plays 14 of his 17 games in a dome, 9 of which are at home where he does do a ton of damage. We know his wide receivers are great, the offensive great. We just know what Jared Goff is as a safety net at the quarterback position that I don't mind here in the 9th round. Now, if you already have a quarterback by going QB really early, or maybe you grabbed Kyler Murray, I'll take the shot on Christian Watson here as the second Packers receiver off the board. I'm not really a huge Christian Watson fan, but in this range of receivers as a wide receiver 42, there's really no one here that has the massive upside ceiling of being a top 15 or even top 12 guy like Christian Watson does. If he can stay healthy, if he puts it all together, I'll take the shot on Christian Watson just to see what happens. All right, 10th round now, and this is another pretty gross list of names, but one guy in particular stands out. And if you've watched my content, you know exactly who I'm talking about. Jaguars receiver Brian Thomas Jr. I truly believe that BTJ is going to be the second best rookie wide receiver this year, behind only Marvin Harrison. Better than Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey, Keon Coleman, anyone else that you think should be up there, I think BTJ is going to outproduce all of them. There's a clear path to BTJ just replacing Calvin Ridley in this offense, which if you don't remember, is a 1,000-yard receiver with 8 touchdowns on 136 targets. That is what a 29-year-old and very rusty Calvin Ridley did last year as the ex-receiver for the Jaguars. Now you plug in a 21-year-old with 4.33 speed, coming off of a massive breakout season at LSU last year, and 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns almost feels like a median outcome. Like BTJ wouldn't really need to try all that hard, and he can just easily replicate that season. And not to mention that Trevor Lawrence excelled on intermediate to deep throws last year, especially over the middle and left side of the field. Compare that to BTJ's chart, which shows his massive success on intermediate to deep routes, especially on routes that shade to the middle or left side of the field, and this is literally a perfect match made in heaven. And BTJ's skill set is going to break open this offense's dynamic abilities as a whole. I'm honestly willing to take BTJ in the 9th round, but with a mid to late 10th round ADP, there's really no excuse for him not to be on every single one of your fantasy rosters this year. I will also shout out Jerome Ford here too as another 0 RB target. He was very solid for the replacement for Nick Chubb last year, and Chubb is currently not back yet, so Ford could have another handful of weeks as the starter again this year for the Cleveland Browns, and that is more than worth a 10th round pick. All right, I'm not going to go individually through the last few rounds, especially because ADP can just really fly out of the window at this point in drafts. So to give you some of my favorite late round targets to round out the back end of your rosters, in no particular order, I would be looking at guys like Blake Corum, Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, Josh Palmer, Chuba Hubbard, Khalil Herbert, Brandon Cooks, Jaleel McLaughlin, Jalen Wright, Jalen Polk, Javon Baker, and Dontavian Wicks. If you waited for quarterback this long, I'd be looking at guys like Trevor Lawrence, Matthew Stafford, and the upside shot on Will Levis. And if you waited on tight end, I'd look at guys like Luke Musgrave, Pat Freiermuth, or Zach Ertz. And as for defenses, I really just look at week 1 matchups. So I'd be looking at Seattle, Minnesota, New Orleans, Atlanta, the LA Chargers, and my favorite defense, honestly, is the Vegas Raiders, who have a fantastic start to the year with the Chargers in week 1. They do play Baltimore in week 2, so that's kind of tough. You'll probably need a replacement there. But then they get Carolina, Cleveland, Denver, and Pittsburgh through week 6. That is juicy to start the year and save yourself some waiver moves and fab by not picking up a ton of defenses every week early on. So just to put a nice little bow tie on a very long video, my absolute perfect fantasy football draft would look something like this out of the 4 or 5 spot. You get hammer running backs in Breece Hall and Isaiah Pacheco, a great wide receiver core, a shot on the tight end 1 overall this year, and a bunch of late round upside or some consistency to pad your starting lineup on a weekly basis. This is exactly how I want to be leaving my drafts if you can manage a top 5 pick. Now, if you find yourself more towards the back of the first, then this would be an ideal draft for me there, where you flip the script a little bit with wide receivers early, then some values on running backs later, still trying to draft an elite tight end, and then again, all of the bench upside that you can get, because ADP kind of doesn't matter once you get past round 8 or so. Just go and get your guys.